I'm Brad Parks, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Brad Parks.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. I hope you are enjoying the shows as much as I'm enjoying bringing them to you. You know, as always, you can go over to hankgarner.com and click over in the right-hand sidebar and subscribe to the show. You'll never miss an episode. It costs you nothing, and it helps other people find the show. The more people subscribe, the higher we go in the rankings on iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher Radio and YouTube and everywhere we are. And thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. I'd like to thank some sponsors who, due to their generous support of the show, help bring this to you each and every time we bring you the show. From Eamon Ambrose, author of the best-selling sci-fi serial 0 Hour, comes a new novelette, Love and Other Algorithms. When Frank, a personal robot assistant, meets a similar model named Shelley, they are inexplicably linked and form an instant bond. But when outside forces conspire to separate them, Frank must decide how far he will go to save their relationship. However, all is not as it seems, and as Frank searches for Shelley, he learns that they are both part of something much, much bigger. Out now from Amazon, Love and Other Algorithms by Eamon Ambrose. Hey authors, are you looking for a beautiful professional cover for your science fiction or fantasy book? Holly Heisey Designs offers custom illustration and cover design with characters that will put your people center stage, spaceships designed from the ground up, and scenery that makes your world come alive. Visit Holly Heisey Design to book a custom cover or view pre-made ebook covers ready to purchase. Holly is an award-winning illustrator and designer who's done work for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the Future Chronicles anthology series, and USA Today and Amazon.com best-selling authors. Holly will bring your story world to life and get you a cover that will help sell your book. Visit hollyheiseydesign.com for more information on how to book your custom cover design or purchase pre-mades, as well as join the Holly Heisey Design Facebook group for discounts and first dibs at all the new spaceship and fantasy pre-made covers. Find all of this at hollyheiseydesign.com. A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson, a military sci-fi political thriller set just a short decade from now in 2031, holding to the concept of individual liberty can get you killed. Western civilization is in collapse, a process led and driven by the world's leading supposed democracies, our own included. What was once the Western world's guiding light of liberty is quickly being replaced by state-sponsored serfdom under the guise of a global economic reset done in the name of the workers. This is an exciting new novel by an exciting new talent, a debut novel, the first in a series from a former CIA operations officer who has decided that his lifelong writing habit, hobby, obsession is more fun than real work. Go pick up a copy today of A Bright Shore, The Eden Chronicles, Book 1 by S.M. Anderson. There's a link to all of our great sponsors in the show notes at hankgarner.com. Stick around at the end of our excellent interview today for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. As always, thanks for listening. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Brad Parks on the show. Brad has a brand new book called Closer Than You Know, and I'm just going to tell you, it is phenomenal. It is nerve-wracking to read and unputdownable. So welcome to the show, Brad.
Hank, it's great to be here, especially with that introduction.
Well, you know, I specialize in introductions.
You gotta butter me up before you break me down. Is that it?
Yeah, I guess it's all downhill from here. Brad, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Because I think for a lot of authors, there's probably a lot of different answers, right? And multiple answers, because we're all on this journey as storytellers, and there's always these mile markers and signposts along the way that say, hey, this is something you're meant to be doing. To pick, so I have about 30 possible answers, Hank, but not to bore your audience completely to death. If I had to pick one, I am in junior year of high school. I had started writing articles for my weekly hometown paper in Connecticut. It was called the Ridgefield Press. I was covering sports for them. And believe me, my early efforts were not what you would say pretended literary greatness, right? I like the very first article I ever covered. It was about the last field hockey game of the year for Ridgefield High School. And I said, indeed, Ridgefield's 1-9-2 record, that's 1 win, 9 losses, and 2 ties, for those who don't know sports nomenclature, it was not indicative of the season Ridgefield had, as it had some hard luck getting the ball in the goal. That was the level of analysis I was bringing. Hard luck getting the ball in the goal. But within about, I started writing for them when I was 14. 2 years later, I had improved, perhaps only barely. But I had a classmate of mine named Jimmy Beasley, who had gotten cancer in his leg. He had a tumor removed from his leg, and his therapy from that was to ride a bike. Well, Jimmy Beasley became a champion cyclist, so it was the inspiring story of Jimmy Beasley. I'm sure if I could unearth it from the archives now, thank God, Hank, this was pre-internet, so you cannot possibly read my horrible kid beats cancer story today. But nevertheless, I put the story in the paper. Jimmy Beasley comes into physics class the next day, and I'm like, wow, what'd you think? He's like, oh, yeah, I really like the story. And my mom cried when she read it.
Oh.
Yeah, and for me, like, I'm 16 years old. I am vapid. I am not all that hooked into my emotions, anything like that. And so, like, the notion that words could move someone like that was totally new to me. And by the way, my words. And I think it was just one of those moments when I fell in love with storytelling and when I fell in love with the power that stories have over all of us.
That's amazing. Yeah, that you cannot diminish the impact of knowing that your words move someone to tears. Yeah. That's life-changing, for sure.
Well, and one of the most gratifying things, and this perhaps speeds up your interview to places you don't want it to go yet, but my latest book before Closer Than You Know was called Say Nothing, and I cannot tell you how many emails I've gotten from readers saying, I cried at the end. And that is so gratifying to me. Well, one, it's nice because I cried when I wrote the end, Hank.
Oh, yeah.
So I would hate to be the only one crying here. By the way, I not only cried when I wrote the end, I cried every time I edited the end of that book. And I must have edited that book 15 times. And I know what's going to happen. I know the end, and yet I'm still crying. And as a matter of fact, one of my crowning achievements as an author, I moved the Washington Post to tears. In the Washington Post review, the reviewer, Patrick Anderson, who's a longtime thriller reviewer and a very respected voice in the genre, said something along the lines of, this is very unusual for me, but the ending of this book moved me to tears. So that's, that's a sign that whatever you have attempted to do as a writer has probably worked out okay.
And yet you had the audacity to write another book and try to top that.
I should have just hung it up there. It's too bad, Hank, that my children need to eat.
Right.
It just ended at that perfect moment and just walked off into the sunset. Yes.
I love it. So you spent quite a few years writing sports professionally and then into other forms of journalism, didn't you?
Yeah, I was a sports writer. Up until the age of 30. So I spent my 20s as a traveling sports writer, which is a wonderful way to spend your 20s. I mean, I was spending 120 nights a year in a Marriott hotel. What could be better when you're 27, right? Right. But then suddenly I'm turning 30. I'm getting married. We're starting to talk about a family. I always have this vivid memory. I was covering the Yankees. We were up in Toronto. And I was walking out of the Sky Dome with the beat writer for the New York Daily News. At that point, I was working for the Newark Star-Ledger in New Jersey. And we were just kind of like trading, hey, how you doing kind of stories. We had filed. It was, midnight, 1 o'clock. And I'm like, oh, so what's going on with you? And he said, oh, my kid started kindergarten today. And it was one of those moments where I could see into the future that if I stayed being a sports writer, I was going to be that guy that when my kid started kindergarten, the kid was going to be like, where's daddy? And my wife would have to consult her pocket schedule, to find out whether I was in Cleveland or Minnesota or somewhere else. And I just didn't want that life. So that's why at the age of 30, I left sports. But I do have to say sports was wonderful training for what I do now and what I've always done, really, because sports is all about stories, right? Every day you go to the ballpark, you find a story, you tell a story, especially in the modern era where everybody already knows the score. They already know the stats. You have to give them insight behind that score. You have to tell them a story that they don't have access to sitting in their home. So I think that became a really great training for me. Every day, find a new story, find a new story, find a new story.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, because I've talked to a lot of journalists who have kind of spun that career into writing fiction, and I know that you moved into that before writing fiction as well. But on kind of first blush, you don't think of sports as sports reporting as deep storytelling. But some of the greatest movies that we watch or books that we've read that inspire us, and the greatest underdog stories are always sports stories. As a sports journalist, how do you feel that experience helped you later on as a fiction writer?
Sports, Hank, are all about passion when you think about it. And passion is great grist for the mill for any storyteller and a novelist in particular. Where I think that it's one, it's about passion, and then two, it's about a basic human desire. And I think most great fiction boils down to some of those basic human desires, whether it's greed or lust or the desire for greatness or whatever it is. These kind of like, we can always take these big stories and boil them down to something simple. And it's all there with sports. I didn't feel like sports loaded my tablet with anything less than other areas that I then later moved into as a journalist loaded my tablet with. I mean, it was really, it was a rich and fertile field. And when you think about it, when I would go to a Yankee Stadium, say there would be 56,000 people there to witness that Yankees game. Let me tell you, when I later moved into, say, covering government, there were not 56,000 people at the town council meeting really interested in what was going on there. So I think, sports is just about tapping into the passion of the fan and the incredible dedication of the athlete. Because, bear in mind, these are athletes who have spent their entire lives working on this one thing and for the most part are very expert at it and very dedicated to it. So it's a field that has, I think, a lot to offer any storyteller.
Sure. How did you make the transition into news journalism?
It was kind of made for me. I mean, like I said, I kind of just really wanted to get off the road. And it just so happened at the paper I was at, the guy who had hired me as sports editor had moved over to become, really kind of the editor-in-chief in waiting. And so he said, hey, why don't you come over here and write some feature stories for me? And it came at a time when I was ready for something new. And the next thing I knew, I was being thrown. My very, very first story on Newside, Hank, was a quadruple homicide in Newark, New Jersey. 4 people shot in the back of the head, left for dead in a vacant lot in the south part of the city. And if you come across my debut novel, again, not to speed up your interview here, Hank, but my debut novel is 4 people shot in the back of the head, left for dead in a vacant lot in Newark, New Jersey. So, I obviously I started very early with the fiction thing once I went over to news side. But it was a wonderful, wonderful time in my life. I was on news for 4 years, and it really opened my eyes to that broader world. Certainly, it brought me into contact with a lot of crime, which is very important because you discover with crime, and it sounds weird and ghoulish to say I loved covering crime because obviously I hated the crime, but on most days when you were on the crime beat, you were talking to people who had been impacted by that crime. And that was probably the worst day of their lives when you were talking to them. And you learn from a fictional standpoint, the worst day of your life is a great place to start. So in Say Nothing, which we just talked about, it's about a federal judge whose children had been kidnapped by someone looking to control the outcome of a case he's hearing. So every day of that judge's life in that book is the worst day of his life. And it's very much the same with Closer Than You Know. And we'll get to this in a little bit. But here is a young mother whose child has been taken away by social services. And she keeps spiraling into the worst day of her life, followed by an even worse day. And you learn that, again, that is just a wonderful, wonderful place to explore from a storytelling standpoint.
Well, I would think that that writing sports, there's a certain gamut of emotion that you're covering. There's the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, to borrow. But rarely, there are occasions in sports where tragedy strikes, and of course, there's a great place to pick apart those emotions. But I would think those emotions are few and far between. But like you said, first day, quadruple homicide. How do you, as a journalist, deal with that level of grief and emotion and grisliness that you're thrown into the middle of?
Well, you have to, in some ways, it's a weird balance of you have to wall yourself off from it because you have a job to do, but then you also have to let it in because if you don't let it in, I would argue you're not doing that job well enough. So it is that balancing act. I mean, I think really you let the story drive you, right? And you put the story first, and the story is this dynamic human stuff that you then have to open yourself up to. If that makes sense. So I would absolutely feel it. And that was hard sometimes, for sure. I mean, I would come home some days and just throw myself on the couch, just emotionally worn out from what I had seen and what had happened to the poor folks I had talked to. And, but I think that sometimes made the journalism really difficult, but it also made the writing I did about it better, measurably. And there were dangers and pitfalls to that. I mean, I covered Hurricane Katrina, and I can remember coming home from, I think I spent 2 weeks down in New Orleans, seeing really unimaginably bad stuff, whether it was bodies floating in the water or, the unspeakable concentrated poverty that suddenly was being brought together and the lack of a response to it and all this kind of stuff. And coming away from an experience like that, actually, I suffered PTSD for a while. And I suffered survivor's guilt because I eventually got to, drive back to Houston and hop on a plane and come home to my nice normal life, whereas everybody I'd been covering, they were still shattered. So that was, it's tough stuff sometimes, Hank. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, we lived through Hurricane Katrina in South Mississippi. And to this day, people, get the eye twitch when, you start talking about storms and stuff. It's pretty heinous stuff. So that first experience that you're covering that then became your first book, or at least informed your first book. When did you know, okay, this is a piece of fiction that I need to tell?
Relatively quickly, because here was the thing. I was a sports writer. So I was used to going to the ballpark and getting kind of a full story to tell. I mean, sports are always this neat beginning, middle, and end every time you go to the arena. Well, here was this story in the vacant lot in Newark that had a beginning. We knew 4 people had been killed. We knew they had been left in the vacant lot, but it didn't have a middle. It certainly didn't have an end. We didn't know who had done this. We didn't know why they had been killed. We didn't really know anything. And as the days and weeks dragged by with that story, it wasn't being solved. No answers were forthcoming. And for the storyteller in me, that was deeply dissatisfying. And so I think that I started with that as my takeoff, and I made the reporter character the hero because Hank, the reporter, is always the hero.
Always.
And then I just invented everything else, basically, because I wanted to know an ending to that story, not necessarily the ending, but it needed to have some ending to it. And so I just set about and invented it.
And which book did that become?
That became Faces of the Gone, which was my debut novel.
Wow. When you wrote that book, well, first off, how long did it take you to write that first initial book?
Well, so it's always a slow thing. So that was Thanksgiving 2004, that quadruple homicide. And I probably wrote over the course of about a year and a half, not because it actually took me that long to write, but because I wasn't a very disciplined writer yet. I would write for a few days, and then something at work would happen, and I'd put it down for a few weeks. And then I'd get into a good stretch for another few days, and then something in my personal life would happen, and I'd put it down for another few weeks. And of course, every time you restart, like getting back up on the bicycle is always just so difficult. So that's why it took me a year and a half. And then it took even more time, to find an agent and all that stuff. But I got the call, as they say, that the book had been acquired on July 8th, 2008. So from writing to getting an agent to learning I had a publishing contract was about a 3.5 year process, which I fully bear in mind. If you have aspiring authors listening to this podcast, Hank, they're going to go, oh, 3.5 years? You tough baby. I've been working on this for 2 decades, you bastard. And I totally honor that struggle and understand that I was very lucky. Bear in mind the difference between me and some other folks. I was a professional writer that whole time. And that, I think, was an enormous advantage of just I knew how to write clean copy, and I knew how to write on a deadline, and that I think served to, and other journalists I'm sure have told you the same thing. It serves to your tremendous advantage when you are already writing professional clean copy.
What's interesting, Brad, is that you said that you were not a very disciplined writer for this project, but you obviously were a disciplined writer because you were turning in copy every day or nearly every day when you're writing sports and then then news journalism. But one does not necessarily equate the other. You still, as a novelist, you have to sit down every day and put the work in, and one doesn't necessarily translate to the other, does it?
Right. No, well, so the key difference there in journalism, okay, so not many people know this, Hank, but the word deadline actually comes to us from the British penal system, where in the 16 or 1700s, I forget which, they actually would draw a line in the sand in these prisons and say, if you cross that line, you will die. We will shoot you. And I would suggest that in the good old-fashioned world of newspapers, they had a very similar idea of the consequences of messing with deadline. I can remember going out to cover the Yankees for the first time, and the paper I was with held the entire edition for that Yankees result. And the editor explaining to me that every minute he said every minute that the presses stayed idle waiting for me cost $15,000.
Oh my goodness.
In terms of, because the trucks are sitting there, the pressmen are all sitting there, and the press women, and, everything is waiting on that. And he said, what are we paying you a year? And I said the number, and I could do the math very quickly that I was replaceable after about 3 minutes. Right. So, it teaches you yes, it forces discipline on you, to put it that way. And then you switch over to the book side of the world, and there is no one screaming for your story. And that's a difficulty for sure. When you're used to that high pressure environment, I ask myself every day when I'm drafting a novel, it's like, well, what happens if I don't write today? And the answer is nothing. No one's going to call me up screaming. No one's going to demand that I write. Nothing is going to happen. Now, the flip side of that is, what if I don't write any day? What will happen? And again, nothing. The book will not get written. The contract will not get fulfilled. The children will not get fed. So that certainly helps. But I keep a rigid discipline with myself. I am a member of what I call the Church of 1,000 Words. And I call it the church, one, because I like to blaspheme, and two, because I really take it with religious intensity that I have to write 1,000 words today. No ifs, ands, or buts, no exceptions. And if I don't, I'm a morning writer. I like to roll out of bed and don't shave and just kind of, get writing. And if I don't write my 1,000 words in the morning, I got to write them in the afternoon. If I don't write them in the afternoon, I write them in the evening. But darn it, 1,000 words will be written today, one way or another. And that's my discipline now.
Well, I know a lot of authors that worship at that altar, and
yes.
and apparently it has borne itself out, because if you write 1,000 words a day, that you can put out a couple of books a year easily. Right. It's just the math is on your side. One thing that we don't talk about a lot is that if you get your 1,000 words a day. And you're writing full time, and you don't have those deadlines of the newspaper and things like that anymore. What about the kind of trappings that come with being an author, and all of the things that you do every day that have nothing to do with writing, but have to do with your writing career? Was that a shock to you when you're completely doing this full time and you're on your own and no one's screaming at you for the copy? Do you find that the other things of publishing work their way in and try to steal your time as well?
I guess I always remember when I'm actually making my money. And I am actually making my money when I'm actually in the chair writing. All that other ancillary stuff is not really what I'm getting paid to do. And so first of all, I don't mind it. I listen to authors complain. I think, you know what? There are about 1 million people who are lining up behind you right now who love to have problems right now, sir or ma'am. So I'm really mindful of that. And I think of it as being a small business owner. And there are going to be responsibilities and there are going to be things you need to do. But I mostly enjoy it. I mean, sometimes it's just talking about writing or writing about writing. And those are things I enjoy. So I've never felt like there's anything too onerous in the whole process. I mean, I really enjoy the totality of being an author. Probably the only thing I don't enjoy is when I get to that spot in the plot where it's like, oh God, I've worked myself into a corner. What am I going to make happen now? And then it's, sheer terror. But, compared to that, getting on a podcast with you, Hank, is not really that hard a job.
Well, and there are lots of days, Brad, that I just do not feel motivated. I feel like there's a million things I could do. And sitting down to talk with someone else about storycraft and about the arc of their life every time fires me up. And I'm just, I'm excited to do some of the things that go along with it. So, you never can.
You're using me, Hank. I get it. You're using me.
I am absolutely using you. That's right. Those first several novels that you wrote, you had a character called Carter Ross, right. And you mentioned him just briefly a minute ago. But where did Carter come from? And tell us about his journey through your books.
So I'll be honest, Hank. Carter comes from sheer laziness. And either that or necessity. And the necessity was this. I was writing those first couple novels basically at 6 o'clock in the morning. Because when you're a daily journalist, 6 o'clock in the morning is the only time of day you can actually control. Because, once I got to work and news would break and stuff would happen, I had no control over my day. It's not like I could, stop at 6 o'clock at night and say, all right, editors, I'm going home to write my novel now. I mean, you'd be shot if you did that. But 6 o'clock in the morning was a different story. My editors were all asleep. Nobody needed anything. Nobody was yelling at me. So when I was writing, I would get up and write from 6 o'clock until 9 o'clock in the morning. And the thing about 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock in that range in the morning is you can't call up experts. So I couldn't really do a lot of research on these novels. I really had to write something I knew intimately, which is being an investigative newspaper reporter. I think the other thing about Carter is I came from this journalistic tradition where you are taught you, reporter, are not the story. Right? The story is the story. Your job is to get out of the way and tell it. So in what little thought I put into Carter before I began crafting him, I thought, okay, I really want a character who can kind of fade into the background, allowing the story that he is telling to rise to the fore. So I kind of just want him to be boring and milquetoast. And who is the most boring person I have ever met? Oh, me! I am. And so I based Carter on me because I thought I truly am this horrifically boring, uncontroversial white guy. And therefore, this will be great because my stories will matter more than the character, and that'll be fine. It was the absolute shock of my life, Hank, when these books started coming out and people actually wanted to know more about Carter Ross. And, it was like, really? You do? Are you sure? Because he's boring, right? You get that. I mean, I dress him in khaki pants and plain white shirts and either a red tie or a yellow tie. He just could not be more of a dull individual in a lot of ways. And yet people were fascinated by him and wanted to know more about him. And so as time moves along in the series, the full extent of the humanity I gave him in the first book was I think I gave him a cat, and that was it. He had a cat. Yeah. But, and he did have a girlfriend. Now, mind you, the girlfriend is with Tina Thompson, the hot city editor, is actually the one true piece of fiction in that novel because unlike me, Carter Ross is single. I am not. I am married. Right. And I knew as I was creating this character very much in my own image that my wife would be reading this stuff. And so when I was creating Tina Thompson, the love interest, I wanted to make sure she was no one like anybody I had ever met, ever dated, ever, bumped into in the grocery store. Because the last thing I needed was for my wife to be reading this novel going, wait a second, brown hair, tall, is this Michelle from The Office? Do you have a crush on Michelle? You actor. This is just sick wish fulfillment fantasy for you, isn't it? I didn't need that stuff, right? So that's why Tina Thompson is pure fiction. But then as the series went along, again, readers just kind of kept clamoring to know more about Carter and more about his family and more about what drove him. And so I found myself kind of inventing a backstory for Carter that I didn't know existed before. So it was fun over the course of 6 books, and hopefully there will be more to watch Carter evolve and to watch Carter, kind of get some more humanity. And it was really, truly only in reaction to reader demand.
I think Carter probably resonates with the everyman kind of fantasy that we have, that our mundane lives, sometimes something epic or amazing could drop into our path, and maybe we could step up and we could, uncover the truth and all that instead of just, going back and forth to work.
Right. Well, but I think, though, the key thing, though, and this is something I've discovered about myself, Carter does this with a set of tools that are very familiar to guys like you and I, which is to say, not much of a set of tools. Carter cannot break someone's jaw just by looking at it. He does not speak Mandarin, Swahili, and Sanskrit. He cannot crack code. He can't even fire a gun, really. I mean, he's just kind of this ordinary guy. And I think those are the kind of characters I find myself gravitating towards. I always say in order to fully inhabit a character, it needs to be somebody I could bump into at the grocery store. And, in Carter, you will definitely bump into him at the grocery store. He's a bachelor, so all he's doing is getting frozen pizza and maybe beer and then heading for the checkout aisle. But he's definitely there in the grocery store, no doubt about it.
And you'll probably bump into him and never remember him.
No, exactly. Just another boring, stiff white guy at the grocery store.
So was Say Nothing the first book that didn't have Carter?
Yeah, and it was my first standalone novel, and it was a real leap for me from a storytelling standpoint, both in terms of the complexity of the story and also in terms of the emotion of the story. As I said, it's a book that made me cry, made everyone else cry. I definitely dug deeper in that novel than I had dug in any of the 6 Carter Ross books.
Do you find do you find it interesting that Say Nothing, when you left Carter, you went super deep emotionally and kind of cracked your own writing code? Is there any reason for that you can put your finger on?
I think I was just growing up, Hank. I hate to say that. I hate to think of myself that way, but Carter was.
It's reality.
Yeah, well, Carter was this happy-go-lucky bachelor guy, right? And when I started writing Carter, was I still a bachelor? No, I was married for about 6 months. But, we didn't have kids. At that point, you're still just kind of pretending and playing at marriage. And so it was very easy for me to access that happy-go-lucky bachelor guy. But as time has gone along, I've got 2 kids. Life becomes a little more serious. And I think it's children that did it to me, because suddenly everything in the world is not just some random crappy thing that happens to you. It's something that can potentially happen to your child. And that just makes it seem a lot more impactful and just a lot higher stakes. And so I definitely just felt like I was becoming more emotional. I was realizing what mattered in the world, and I wanted to start writing characters that also reflected that. And so, Say Nothing was a grueling book to write. Again, it was a judge whose children are kidnapped by someone looking to control the outcome of a case he's hearing. So on page 3 of this novel, this judge's kids are taken away from him. And what a horrific thing to have happen. And, I really found myself living this very much alongside the judge. And man, I would come home from writing some days and talk about you want to hug your kids a little harder. Yeah. I mean, it was really just a gripping thing to have happen. And even that ending when I cried, like there were other days when I was just wiped out by the story I was creating and by the characters and what they were going through.
What's really interesting, Brad, is that we never want to imagine these things happening to our families, our children. Yet we will sit down and we will write these things. And it's almost a catharsis in some weird way. I wrote a book a couple of years ago. One of my daughters was going through, she had a brain tumor at the time. Oh. And she's all wonderful now. But the story was a little girl that had cancer, and I did not want to write that, but that has become the thing that has resonated most deeply with everybody, and it helped me to deal with some of those feelings I was having, and I definitely didn't want to do that, but there's this it's kind of like why people write horror. Some horror writers are some of the sweetest people you would ever meet.
Oh, absolutely.
Yet they write some heinous stuff. It's the human condition is a strange thing.
Steve Hamilton, who, if you haven't had on your show, you should. He's a brilliant writer. Once said to me some words that really stuck. He said, "I think you have to write the book that scares you." And
I agree with that.
Yeah, that's certainly what Say Nothing was for me, and also what Closer Than You Know was for me. And we haven't gotten into that yet, but Closer Than You Know was just a terrifying scenario to me as well. And because I think what I discovered is when you write the book that scares you, You are bringing real terror to the page, and that energy in the writing, I think it rubs off on the reader. They get that, like that this is not just some thing you're dreaming up, that it's to you, it's real. And if it's real to the author, chances are a lot better it's going to be real to the reader. And isn't that, I think, a lot of what attracts us to crime fiction is we want to get close to that scary, awful thing that we can only barely imagine, right? And that maybe we can approach it from the just barely safe distance that is fiction. But I certainly know when I'm writing these books or when I'm reading a really good book, whether it's you walk away from the keyboard and you still feel it, or you're walking away from the nightstand and you're still feeling it. That to me is the hallmark of a successful book. It's making you feel things even when you're not around it.
Well, let's talk about Closer Than You Know. Even the title of this book is a little ominous, and the cover is fantastic. It really gives this creepy vibe of that something is going on right under our nose. First off, what was the genesis of this book? Where did the idea come from, and how did you start unraveling all of these horrible things that could go wrong right under our nose?
So the genesis is, okay, you're a dad, I'm a dad. As parents, I think we've all probably made this joke at one point or another, and that is, we've done something stupid and boneheaded. We didn't change the baby's diaper in time, and now it's drooping, or we send the kid off to school without fruit in her lunch, or ripped clothes, or whatever it is, and then we make that joke. Social services is going to come to collect the kid. But what if that wasn't a joke? What if that actually happened? And that is the scenario that is facing Melanie Barrick, the protagonist of this novel. She is a young working mother. She comes home to pick up her kid from childcare, only to learn the baby has been taken away and no one will even tell her why.
Wow. Was this informed by a real life story that maybe you heard or read, or?
It was really informed by my time as a reporter in Newark, where I became aware of just what an enormous presence that social services was in the lives of certain families, right? I mean, making kind of these huge, impactful decisions about, are you going to get to keep your kid? Are you not going to get to keep your kid? And in particular, for the parent involved, the feeling of helplessness, right? You don't get to make that choice. Once social services is in your life, they are the ones making the decision. And the feeling of powerlessness was something very much I wanted to put into Melanie Barrick, because what a sheerly terrifying feeling. And the other thing about Melanie, of course, and this gets to the title, Melanie is herself a survivor of the foster care system. She was abandoned by her parents when she was 9 years old, when her drug-addicted mother was basically given a choice. She was told, hey, look, Mrs. Barrick, you can either stay with this awful man who is beating your children, or you can lose them. And the wife, that Melanie's mother, was so addled by drugs and also so cowed by the man who had been abusing her. And of course, anybody who studies spousal abuse recognizes that beaten down woman who can't even get away from her tormentor. The mother makes the decision that she's going to just let her child go. But, maybe because she's too drug addled, or maybe because in some deep part in her heart she realizes she's doing the best thing for her child. Well, this plunges Melanie into a childhood where good luck trying to get a 9-year-old adopted. Everybody wants to adopt babies, Hank. Nobody wants that 9-year-old. And so she is bouncing around from foster care setting to group home, from group home to another setting that might be permanent. Oh, and then it's not permanent. And so it's a line that actually comes from one of her foster care systems. Young Melanie, she's maybe 11 or 12, is moaning because she's being ripped out of a foster care system setting where she was really comfortable, to be sent to a group home. And she goes, oh my God, this is a disaster. And her foster sister says, honey, this is foster care. Disaster is always closer than you know. And so I think that sense for Melanie, now Melanie, like I said, she's a survivor of foster care, which is what makes what is happening to her child being taken away by social services all that much more terrifying, because she knows better than anyone just how cruel the system can be. And I think that sense from her childhood, even though Melanie has gone on to become a well-adjusted adult, she's got a not great job, but a job, and college graduate, a husband, like all this nice stuff that she's created for herself in adulthood, but still that sense of disaster is closer than you know, I think has never really truly left her.
The emotion is very raw and close to the bone, if you will, in this book. Did this story have to be told from Melanie's perspective? I think this is the first book you've written from with a female protagonist. In reading it, I don't feel like that this story would have the emotional resonance if you were telling the man's side of the story, although it would be just as bleak and hard, but there's just something extra raw about this.
Yeah, I think it was, as I thought about the story, so I started with that what if I told you that, what if social services had taken away someone's kid and wouldn't even tell them why, and isn't that terrifying? Because by the way, that is very much, believe it or not, grounded in the law, Hank. No matter where you live, there is an agency of county government that has the authority to take your kid from you. So this what if is not actually as far-fetched as some people might believe it to be. And that's, again, something I learned from my time as a newspaper reporter. But as I thought about, okay, yeah, who is going to tell this story? How am I going to tell this story? I just kept coming around to it's got to be told from the mom's perspective. She is the one who is being most impacted with this, especially when she doesn't know who the father of the child is. So we're dealing with even though she's married to another man, and we'll get into that in the story. She's really truly the only parent here, and it had to be Melanie's story, and that was frankly, a little terrifying, because I'd never written a book from a female perspective. I've also, Hank, never myself been female. I know, shocking. And, so I could tell myself, the things I told myself going in were like, well, okay, I was raised by a strong woman. My mother always worked outside of the home, always taught her sons to be independent and whatnot. I'm married to a strong woman. My wife is much, much smarter than I am. And so I'm put in my place on a daily basis. I am raising my daughter to be a strong woman. And I'm sure she will, the signs are already very strong that she will become so, but it's still, that's very different from now I have to put myself in a woman's situation and actually think like a woman and be a woman. And so I was intimidated going into it. But what really struck me very early on, once I got into the book, was how very little it mattered in most of the scenes. There were maybe one or two scenes in this book where Melanie's gender rose to the fore of what she was thinking or feeling. Like there's a scene early on where she has to go knock on the door of a trailer of her 300-pound neighbor, Bobby Ray Richardson, and then she has to go into the trailer, and the physical feeling of vulnerability she feels being alone in a trailer with a 300-pound guy who could very easily overwhelm her. That was probably one time when she felt conspicuously female. Obviously, there's some scenes where she's a nursing mother. I mean, she's still lactating when this baby is taken away from her, and dealing with those issues. That's maybe one time when her gender mattered. But in most of the scenes, gender was maybe the 7th or 8th or 9th most important thing that was motivating her actions, is what I found. I mean, it was really much more, okay, what does this character want? What does this character need? How is she going to get it? What's standing in her way? I mean, it was the same questions I'd always asked with Carter Ross or any of my male characters. And it all reminded me of a favorite bumper sticker that I saw when I was writing. It was on a friend's car. It said, "Feminism is the radical notion that women are people." And so that's really how I ended up approaching these characters, not as female characters, but as people who happen to be female.
I love that approach, and I think you're absolutely right. So you've this book is phenomenal, and when this show airs, it'll be available, and I want everyone to go rush out and buy their copy in hardback and support Brad telling these amazing stories. But what are you working on now, Brad? This book's turned in, gone to the publisher. Obviously, did some other story capture your imagination right after this one?
God, Hank, let me catch my breath. Oh, God, man, what are you doing to me? No, for those who are familiar with the publishing cycle, if you are on a 1-a-year cycle, you are basically turning in your next book and then going on book tour for your previous book. And that's what I'm doing. So yeah, my 2019 book is tentatively titled The Last Act. I don't know, that title might change. I sometimes I go back and forth with my titles. So that is actually, it is all done. The premise of that is that an out of work actor is hired by the FBI to infiltrate a prison where he has to befriend a guy who has documents that could bring down a notorious Mexican drug cartel.
Good Lord.
I'm not sure I did that elevator pitch well. See, Hank, I got a whole year to work on that elevator pitch before I have to do the Hank Garner interview the next, and I'll have it better since then. But basically, yeah, it's an out of work actor who's being hired by the FBI, and they're bringing down a cartel, and it is all set or mostly set in a federal prison, which was lots of fun because it meant I got to go to prison for this book.
I love it. Brad, the new book is called Closer Than You Know. I'm going to send everybody to go pick up a copy. It's amazing. And thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Well, I appreciate your flogging the book for me, Hank. And I really, if I can say a final word, and perhaps you can tell, I got closer to Melanie Barrick, perhaps because she was a woman, perhaps because of what she was going through, than any protagonist I have ever created. And that includes the one that I created very much in my own likeness, by the way. So I really hope that readers will get close to her too, and that they will become as enmeshed in her saga as I was.
Absolutely. Brad, can people follow you online? Do you have a website where people can find out new news and stuff like that?
Why, gosh, yes, Hank. What a coincidence! They can. They can go to www.bradparksbooks.com. Or at this point, we're close to 50 minutes into a podcast. If they're still listening, they're big fans, so they can just go ahead and send me an email. My email is brad@bradparksbooks.com. Or if they prefer the safety of Facebook, it's again Brad Parks Books. So www.facebook.com/BradParksBooks. Or on Twitter, I am Brad_Parks. And I welcome all visitors to come to my happy little online domains.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, Brad. And thank you for your time today.
Hank, great time having me on. Thanks very much. And I'll talk to you soon, I hope.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
They reverently slipped Jason's giant-size X-Men #1 from its mylar protector, drinking in the sweet aroma of browning paper and 3-color process that signals only the best and rarest and most wonderful of collectibles. On one page, Professor X raised his fingers to his temples and rallied his X-Men, his psychic commands radiating from his bald head like waves off hot asphalt. "I have psychic powers," Owen blurted. "I want Wolverine's claws." Jason was turning a page. "Snicked! Or, hey, get this. Lightsabers poking out the backs of my hands. Or even, no, I'm totally serious. I have psychic powers." "No, you don't." "I do." Jason laid the comic on the bedspread. He sighed. Owen could be such a spaz sometimes. "Okay," he said indulgently. "What number am I thinking of?" "Stop, it doesn't work that way." What I can do is called a psychic reading, off an object, like getting impressions. When the doorbell rings, if I put my hand on the knob, as soon as I do, I know who's there. It's called looking through the peephole, moron. Shut up! And when I touch the phone, I know who's calling. I'm sure, Mr. Bullshit from Bullshit Mountain. Like my sister or my grandmother, I just know it's them. There's no such thing as psychics. Okay, you try. Don't be stupid. Are you chicken? Fine! Okay. He snatched up a brown paper bag, spotted with grease, and dumped a few stale French fries into the trash can. I'll put an object in this bag, and you try to guess what it is. Turn your back. Jason did, and heard a rustling behind his head. Okay, you can look now. Owen produced the bag. It was rounded with some object now. Don't touch yet, just think. Try to imagine what's inside. Your lunch? Jason sneered, but he closed his eyes and tried to imagine. He could hear Owen's breathing. Jason's nose itched. His brain grew bored with nothing to look at, and fragments of images swam in and out of his imagination. Strawberry, he blurted. Owen reached into the bag, producing a white bowl. Jason had eaten Frosted Flakes from it about 3 days ago. A few stuck to it, like little beige fish scales. See? I lose. No, look here. Owen pointed. A design went around the sides of the bowl. A long string of vines and painted fruit. With strawberries. That's... Jason began, but didn't know how to end the sentence. It's cool. See? What did I tell you? Do it again. Jason closed his eyes. An image like daisies and sun and... Yellow, he blurted after 3 seconds. Oh my God, open your eyes! Owen held a bright yellow highlighter pen. I hadn't even put it in the bag! And so they went, for 30 minutes or more. A staple remover, a toy soldier, a sweat sock, a pencil. Jason never said precisely what was in the bag, but it was always close or related. He'd imagine a cockpit, and Owen would produce a game controller. He'd say plate, and the object would be a CD. He made right angles with his pointer fingers, shrugging, only to have Owen pull out Eliza's knitting needles. His friend became more and more enthusiastic, but Jason became a little scared. You have a real gift, Owen said. You're brilliant. Owen babbled for a long time about astral projection and ESP, how Jason was picking up signals from Owen's own psychic powers, which had obviously been doing the broadcasting. Owen left that night full of plans and experiments, vindicated in his beliefs. Jason sat on the bed after Owen left, thinking hard. He had no explanation for what he'd done, but he knew he hadn't faked it. He couldn't believe, but he couldn't deny either.